Welcome to a new episode of Raiders of the Unknown. Today we have a special guest to help us discern what's going on in both the Jewish and the Christian world regarding the topics that we've been discussing. We had our new co-host, Tony, last time, and I discuss one of the many slanderous accusations against the Jewish people. And I'm going to get kicked out of my radio station because what they told me when I became a member of Radio Free Nashville is don't talk about anything that the conservative radios would talk about. And I don't think they ever talk about anti-Semitism. I don't think they ever talk about how Jews are being targeted, but they do talk about God. They do talk about their faith. So we're doing that, but we're doing that from our perspective and what we have encountered. So Brad, before we get going, I would like for you to share a little bit about your background. We're going to keep it brief because we have two programs that we're recording. We're recording one about almost like debunking MythVision and what they've been doing. And then the other one's going to be talking about the topics that I sent you guys regarding how is the concept of the law, which this is how Christians interpret Torah into the Greek and in the New Testament, how is that have been incorporated into Christianity throughout the centuries. So those are the two topics, but we want to do a short episode on this very like popular show called MythVision and how the host takes a lot of liberties and goes all in on try to disprove the Bible and what tactics he uses to do that. He's actually had some of the same guests that I've had on my show. So it's interesting to see the way that they kind of fit themselves into his format. But go ahead, Brad, if you can tell us about what is your YouTube channel about and how we can discuss these subjects together.
So my name is Bradley. I am the president and co-founder of Alternate Media. We are a ministry that is dedicated to bridging the gap between Judaism and Christianity by reintroducing the Jewish, and I mean thoroughly Jewish roots that Christianity at one time shared. Reintroducing to Christians the Jewish nature of the scriptures that they read and the underlying historical context and cultural relevance of those very scriptures.
Okay, well, it's good to know because there's a lot of organizations out there that discuss that, and I know of a doctorate fellow in Austin who has an organization called the Hebraic Perspective, and there's many ways you can go about it. Here in Raiders of the Unknown, we try to take the academic perspective as much as possible, but we are biased in the sense of when we started our radio show, A Mystic and Skeptic, our goal was to not allow for things to get out of hand. And what I mean by that is that there was a lot of conspiracies, there was a lot of crazy stuff I was hearing all over. And in Judaism, there's a quest for truth. And the quest of truth has been mostly encapsulated by the writings of Maimonides, which, like other religious philosophers, he tries to show how the revelation at Sinai, the ideas that come down through the three monotheistic religions, they can be processed through the natural understanding of the world. So natural philosophy is something that the host of MythVision talks about. And he says that in the actual episode that we're discussing today, he says with his guest that the ontological and epistemological issues addressed by the authors of the New Testament are completely different than the questions that we would ask when we're looking at history. But the one element that they miss, which I find very interesting, they miss the religious anthropology aspect and the religious texts and the concepts that come around when you're looking at the actual what Christians and Jews would share as the Word of God.
Right.
They weren't writing like historical narratives per se. They use a lot of historical ideas, but they're writing theological treatises, which and even in the scientific method used by anthropologists is called hagiography, which is the study of the lives of holy people, saints, and other characters. So to put the historical system over these texts it's easy for me to cry foul, because you're using a modern system to examine old texts. So it's like when people try to use the natural science as we know it, from Darwin all the way to the latest biologists and other people, and they try to use that to study the book of Genesis. It's not fair, because the book of Genesis was written by ancient people with ancient dilemmas and issues that they had. So if you're going to put it through the system of rigorous studies and testing and stuff like that, it's not going to work, because you weren't there, you did not see what they saw, and you can't compare what other fields have been studying in relation to the natural system as compared to a mystic, prophetic person back in the day and what they're trying to convey. So I sent an article about that topic, and they're trying to debunk the book of Acts. What did you guys think about the way they went about it?
Well, personally, I didn't have the time to watch through the whole thing, but I did watch through as much of it as I could, and I definitely see where you're saying there was a lot of reliance on current modern theory without necessarily taking into consideration a lot of the religious undertones that would have been held at the time, right? There's a lot of missing of the nuance of interreligious debates that would have been taking place even at the time in which Acts was being written, in which the events were unfolding. But I come to expect that from such shows.
Okay, so the episode that we're recording right now is called Acts is Not History Fail. And that's what the host and Dr. Carrier, who was the guest, were trying to discuss. And something they kept on doing is talking about it as historical fiction or fan fiction. And again, back then, nobody was writing fan fiction, because they all believed that whatever they were discussing was either their own personal revelation through God, or that they were meditating on what they had seen or on elder texts. So you can go back in time and say, well, the author of Revelation is a plagiarist, because he used all these mystical narratives and ideas from Ezekiel and from Zechariah and from Daniel. Well, that's a ridiculous thing to impose on an ancient writer, because in his eyes, he's communicating something that is true to him. So again, you take an ancient text and you put it through modern perspective. Same thing with the Gospels. If you say that you can't rely on the Gospels because they have 4 witnesses and they all contradict each other, well, are you using the reporter's method, where you have to ask the right questions to get to the bottom of the truth? Or are you using what most people would know as, different perspectives or theological points that they were trying to push? Tony, I want to see from you. I know that we talked about using a rational approach to look at the New Testament. Do you think it's fair to judge ancient texts with modern sensibilities, especially when they start saying, how can this guy go do this? How can this guy do that? Like, they start getting personal with Paul or Peter or something like that, and they're saying that it's ludicrous that so many miracles can happen all at once, and then nobody's questioning them. So it's almost, again, it's like you have a beef with whatever they're saying, and now you're trying to debunk it, but you're using a system that you claim is more objective and more truthful, but again, is not historically objective like it's supposed to be. Now it's more like an attack against these texts.
Yeah, so I see it as a first off an anachronistic view. They're trying to apply modern understanding to what was going on at the time as they were unfolding. So I try to be more rational with my approach to give the benefit of the doubt. I think what happens is since people are taught from pulpits and their tradition within modern Christianity or Christianity as it has been for the last 2,000 years, people are taught that the New Testament is like the infallible Word of God, and I think that sets yourself up for a dilemma, because we're talking about testimonials, which, mind you, weren't codified until decades later. So the New Testament started off as an oral tradition, by the testimony of men, them trying to debunk certain miracles and things like that. It's like, how can you debunk something when you weren't there? You didn't witness it. You weren't there. And the people that, the text that we have are eyewitness testimonials for things that these people saw, and they're just giving a testimony. Now, it's up for you to believe it or not. And so when you take things and you look at them from a just strictly literal approach, and you're not looking at, like you said, the testimony of human beings, you want to get to the essence and to the core of the message being taught. So a lot of people try to debunk things, and their premise is false to begin with. So they're not looking at culture, history, political influence, things going on at the time. So I see these people as just, I think they're trying to dissect it from a scholarly view, an academic view, but at the same time, they're leaving out logical views and ways to be able to approach the text. So with that being said, I mean, there's no consistency with any of these groups of people trying to debunk certain things, the book of Acts, the Gospels, the writings of Paul. So I think it's erroneous, and it's kind of like hypocritical in areas, because say they were under the gun of a microscope, maybe someone was trying to debunk them in a testimonial of what they were saying. Well, when they are faced with that same situation, they're going to want to say, well, have you looked at it from this perspective? Have you thought about this perspective? Have you looked at this? So they leave out a lot of those things to be able to open it up, to be able to say, give the benefit of the doubt for certain testimonies.
And for those who are interested, the article is called "How We Know Acts is Fake History" by Dr. Richard Carrier. You can find it at richardcarrier.info. And the one thing that I found the most problematic is that he portrayed it as there's a bunch of fables that were famous at that time. So he says that there's a lot of things in the book of Acts that comes from the Odyssey. I know that the host of MythVision's says that everything comes from the Iliad. So, and then they say that it borrows a lot from Josephus, that is poorly written, that the history makes no sense, and that they hit good points here and there in relation to how it would be easy for someone to fake a story since they believe that it was late in the game that it was written. The problem, and this is something that Tony and I have talked about a lot, is that you can be, let's say someone writes something about the Holocaust, 70 years from now, or like in the past, and they go to Poland, they go to the concentration camp, they study the place, and they come up with as much of a historical reconstruction as they can. But there's one thing that they can't do, and that is have a true point of view, that if you were to talk to a Holocaust survivor, unless they interviewed them, that they would be able to find out where everything is at, like where did the guards do their thing, and where the people go and stuff like that. So they're saying that someone about 70 to 100 years after the destruction of the temple are able to describe what's going on in Jerusalem when the place has been burned to the ground. So unless they have a time machine, or they're talking to someone who is like 120 years old, they wouldn't be able to describe how there was a meeting of all the disciples of Jesus in this one room, or they went here, they walked from here to there, or they spread out from country to country and stuff like that. Like that would be very difficult to reassemble if there was not a basic structure. And I'm actually glad that Carrier says that there was a basic text that was an older narrative, and then maybe that's where the author of Acts drew from. So Tony and I have a very open perspective about the New Testament, that you can kind of take it or leave it, in the sense of it's a sectarian text. It was written by a particular group that were trying to share their perspective. For someone like you, Brad, which you, from what I've seen, you consider yourself as part of the overall Christian community. Where is the limitations behind that? Because what we saw in the podcast on YouTube is that they're trying to debunk some other evangelical guy who says that it's all history and that it's all the word of God and it's inerrant and it is truth. So if you close the system so narrow, it's going to be easy for someone like the people from MythVision to try to knock it down, because they're going to try to find all the holes and all the problems. But for us, if we look at it as a mystical text, if we look at it as the narrative, the expression of a suffering sectarian group that is being persecuted, the longing for the kingdom and all these things that are being conveyed, then there's not that much to fight about, other than, well, you don't agree with what he went through or what he wrote, but the details are important, but they're not the only thing to focus on. How would you respond to either our approach or the approach of the people from MythVision?
Well, I think personally, you guys have a pretty level-headed and understandable approach. One that I can in many ways sympathize with. I think the folks at MythVision, especially Dr. Richard Carrier, if we're gonna analyze this from an academic perspective, the first thing we have to acknowledge is that his position is not just a minority in the scholarly community; it is an extreme minority in the scholarly community. Richard Carrier is, from my understanding, a mythicist. All right, so he's somebody who denies that Jesus even existed in history. It is an extreme fringe minority of historical scholarship. So much so that the broader sweeping sects of historical scholarship consider it pretty much a joke. There's actually there's a wonderful debate between he and Bart Ehrman, where Bart Ehrman basically wipes the floor with him on the subject, because the historical evidence for the existence of Jesus as a real historical figure is insurmountable. So when it comes to the Book of Acts, I think one great disservice that they're doing is not taking into account the blatant historical accuracy of its portrayal of certain disputes that were going on internally within Judaism at the time, right? It's not something that is unique to the New Testament. The dispute between the sect of baptism or mikvah and the sect of circumcision is something that we see even recorded in the Talmud, something that was disputed between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. And ultimately, a final ruling was made regarding the necessity of both for conversion to Judaism. But this is something that we find in Jewish history that is more or less not contested in the scholarly community, and that may be because the scholarly community, more or less, as far as New Testament history, doesn't concern itself too much with reading Talmudic literature. You find some here and there that do familiarize themselves with it, but many don't, and I think that that's the disservice that even Rich Carrier here is doing. There's a clear precedence that we see in Talmudic literature for this dispute between these two sects that we see raging pretty fervently all throughout the Book of Acts. You kind of see the beginnings of it, and then through the middle of the Book of Acts, we really see it come to a head, and Paul kind of leads the charge there with that. So I would say to the mythicists the same thing that I would say to the broader Christian community, and that's that before beginning to critique the New Testament as an independent document, you really need to familiarize yourself with Orthodox Judaism, and specifically the Pharisaic Judaism of the first century. If you don't begin there, you're not going to have a well-rounded view of what the New Testament itself is addressing, particularly in the Book of Acts.
Well, we're going to move on to just criticizing the show in general. So if I had all the money in the world and I had all the technology and time in the world, I would be able to create such astonishing videos where he takes all these AI images and found footage, and he creates his narrative. I watched the one about Israel or Jacob, and it's parallelomania to the extreme. And this is something that we discussed on our show many times, where If you find something similar in one religion or in one mythical story, then you go find all the stuff. And thankfully, it's a little more sophisticated than Zeitgeist and some of the other YouTube lunacy out there. But it's still very problematic, because I came up with kind of a Da Vinci Code style comparison between two figures. And you guys might laugh, but this is what I came up with. So if you take Barack Obama and Superman and you put them next to each other, you can do a chart like the host of the show does and says, these are the things that these two people have in common. One, they're both foreigners. So one is an alien living in America, and the other one is the descendant of a Ghanaian raised by European Americans. So see, Superman and Obama are coming from the same source. Then the second one is they were raised to be a hero. Superman knew his powers, and his parents were hopeful he could make a difference. And then Obama's grandfather was a lead politician, and he kind of prepped him to run for office. Third one, he ended up in a powerful role. We know that Superman represents a leader of freedom and the American way, and then Obama became the president. The fourth one, they both married powerful women. One married a reporter, the other one married an attorney. Fifth, they both had two children. In the comic book, Superman has two boys and Obama has two girls. So like you see, that's the kind of stuff that he does. He'll take the story of some mythical character and he actually jumps around. He'll go from Hercules and his brother, and then he jumps into the life of King David, and then he comes back and he finds another philosopher, somebody like deep in the mythological stories of the Greco-Romans, and he says, look, I can see how they took stuff from here, they took stuff from there, and they mixed it together. And then the one thing that he doesn't talk about, which again, if we're going to take a scholarly perspective, is that you have to look at what was going on back then. Almost everybody was part of patriarchal system, so you always had men as the leaders and the ones who were fighting over issues. You have women as very defenseless and chaste. You have people who are shepherds and cattlemen. So he'll take a story, like there's a story about a guy who had cows, and the cows multiplied. And then you have the story of Jacob, and he had sheep, and the sheep multiplied. See, they're the same stuff. They're the same stuff. And it's almost like the game of where's the ball, and you're just moving the cups around. Like if you mix it all together, of course there's similarities, because they're all ancient people. And ancient people had the same desires and needs and wants, and they're all fighting over women, and they're fighting with the gods, and they're trying to make ends meet with whatever's going on. But and the one thing that Tony and I have talked about is that you either believe that the ancient Israelites were cavemen who could not come up with their own stuff, or they were so sophisticated that they could study other people's religions and myths and grab whatever they could in the most tricky way, and then make it look like it was theirs. So now you don't have the Jews only being like stealers of other people's ideas. Now they're stealing them and making them their own, and making their own sacred texts, which you see multiple times in the Torah that you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to borrow or incorporate things from the nations, even though they did in a lot of ways. You know, wherever they went, they had access to their texts and stuff like that. But he's saying that they have access to texts. They're in a different part of the world that they didn't have much contact with, other than by the time the Greeks came and conquered them during the Maccabean revolt or during the Roman occupation. So they're saying before the Alexandrian kingdom passing through, they had access to all the mythological stuff. And we had a guy actually respond to our last YouTube about the accusation against Jews. And he was saying that Jacob and Esau were Romulus and Remus. So how can you say that when Romulus and Remus had a she-wolf as a mother, and now and they have a different one? So, but again, you can find parallels in all kinds of different stories, and then claim, well, it's all baloney anyway. So you're like debunking it by using weird tactics and mixing everything together. What thoughts do you guys have on that?
For me personally, when it comes to similarities, there's a few things again that we really have to heavily consider. The first one is what is typically noted in the broader sweeping similarities is something that we call the hero's journey. It's a literary trope that's been used since the dawn of time. All right. It's something that we see in the story of Joseph. It's something that we see in the story of Moses. Something we see in the story of David. Right. It's the idea of a low standing, not unable, but maybe his capability is not quite so recognized, man who has to overcome a great trial to achieve the status of heroism that is his ultimate goal and his ultimate destiny, so to speak. This is something that we find in every culture. There's no culture that doesn't have it. That doesn't make it not true. Uh, this is something we can even apply to our own lives. And Dr. Jordan Peterson actually has a number of various ways to explain how this trope, this hero's journey, is the story of your life as a man, and it's something that you should apply to your life as a man. It's something that for you as a man, you need to figure out what the dragon is that you're supposed to slay, right? Because it's that idea, right? The trope of the man who slays the dragon to save the damsel, right? So these are not exactly, literal in every sense, though in many ways they very much can be literal. But the damsel is not always going to be a human woman for everybody. There's everybody has something that may take the place of the damsel for them. And the dragon's not going to be a literal dragon, but there are trials that as a man you are supposed to overcome so that you can achieve that status of hero that every man should see himself as. So the literary trope of the hero's journey doesn't invalidate a story. It's one of the most internally true things that is common to humanity across cultures. The other aspect to this cross-culture similarity that we see throughout these narratives, the problem for me with supposing that the Bible is the text that borrowed from other cultures, it's problematic because it's too inconsistent across every other culture. In other words, you can't point out in every aspect of one singular culture where the Bible borrowed from it, right? You might be able to pull fragments from this tradition in that culture, and then another fragment from that tradition in that culture, right? But you can't find the totality of the biblical text and the biblical theme in the totality of another culture. So it seems really that the biblical text and the biblical narrative is actually the central point where all of the other cultures' traditions find a point of convergence, right? Rather than the authors of the biblical text borrowing from other cultures, it rather seems that other cultures have borrowed fragments of the biblical narrative and spun their own version of it.
Tony, do you have any thoughts regarding that?
Yeah, I would also say, and I think Bradley was hinting to the point, correlation is not causation. So you find similarities in cultures, and then you read the Tanakh and you read about the patriarchs, Abraham and Yitzhak and Yaakov, and you see all these different things and these elements that are going on, and people forget that these were real human beings. And we only get certain aspects of their life, certain events, and they interacted with other people. So, before it was codified or written down, who's to say that they spoke about it, they talked about it, and there was an oral tradition passed on about how this element happened, and they were just giving praise to God, and they spoke to maybe a foreigner, and they told him about it, giving praise to Hashem. So, I can see how these things can develop over time, and other nations can take a story, like the flood account. They say, oh, the flood accounts in other nations. And well, of course, because people would talk about something like that. The descendants of Noah would have went on, and they would have told their children and their grandchildren, and it would have just gotten passed on. And, you've got the descendants of Noah that go off and basically assimilate the whole world. So, become the nations, the 70 nations. So those things are going to get passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, and so on and so on. So that's why I say they look at things from a very strict dogmatic point of view, and they set themselves up for failure from that perspective alone, because they're not looking at the other elements and possibilities. They're assuming anything that you bring to the table is an assumption with your parallelisms. So,
yep. The just to add on to that, we can find similarities between Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan, right? There's a similar list, like the one you did with Obama and Superman. There's a similar list of perfect parallels between Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan. Now, both of those figures exist, and we know that they both historically existed. So the idea that parallel of one myth and a real person, or two real people, or two myths, I think we're reaching pretty far if we're trying to draw any hard conclusion based on that case.
Well, we're gonna wrap up that debunking of the debunkers of MythVision and what they're trying to do. I would like for the host of that show to come and join us. Like I said, we have similar themes and similar interests, but when you already have a preconceived notion that a lot of this stuff is bunk and that it has no relevance, because religious texts have a relevance to the followers. So if you have a problem that there's been this ongoing fight throughout the centuries of members of Judaism originally, members of Christianity, members of Islam, pushing their ideas on others, then now is your time to defend yourself and to fight back. But again, why does it bother you so much that people have these views? We, in our show, we try to expose how if you're confident in your convictions, no matter what anybody says, no matter what they put in front of you, it does not shake you, does not cause this anger and frustration. Or if it does, it's an opportunity to create dialogue, to learn from them, to have our minds expanded about something. So again, we've had people who've talked about all kinds of things that we might find problematic or inconsistent, but that's why we want to explore them. We're not starting with the premise, this is wrong, and how can you help me make this case? In the next episode, we'll discuss more some of the issues that come up when you discuss Torah or the application of the Mosaic law in people's lives. But I appreciate both of you guys being on for this discussion.